Thomas sat quietly in the corner booth of the small roadside cafe, watching his 7-year-old daughter Lucy color in her book with careful strokes. The red crayon moved slowly across the page as she drew what looked like a house with a big garden. It had been 6 months since they lost Margaret, and this road trip was meant to help them both heal from the terrible sadness that had settled over their home like a heavy blanket. The familiar weight of grief pressed on his chest as he sipped his tea. Every morning felt the same now, waking up and remembering all over again that Margaret was gone. The doctors had said it was her heart, but Thomas knew better. Margaret had the strongest heart of anyone he knew. She had loved so deeply and so completely that when it stopped beating, it felt like the whole world had gone quiet. Lucy had been so brave through it all. She was only 7, but she seemed to understand that Papa needed her to be strong. She would make him breakfast in the mornings, standing on her little stool to reach the counter, and she would tell him stories to make him smile. But Thomas could see the sadness in her eyes too. She missed her mama's bedtime songs and the way Margaret would braid her hair before school. This trip had been Lucy's idea. She had found an old map in Margaret's things and pointed to a small town where Margaret had grown up. "Can we go there, Papa?" she had asked. "Maybe we can learn more about Mama." Thomas had agreed, thinking it might help them both find some peace. The cafe was warm and cozy, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh bread filling the air. Other families sat at nearby tables, talking and laughing together. Thomas felt a pang of loneliness watching them. He and Lucy used to be part of a family like that, complete and happy. "Papa," Lucy whispered, tugging at his sleeve with her small fingers. "The lady serving food has a necklace just like the one in Mama's picture." Thomas looked up from his teacup to see the waitress walking toward their table. She was a kind-looking woman in her 30s with gentle brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a blue apron over her dress, and round her neck hung a silver locket that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. The locket was identical to the one Margaret wore in their wedding photograph, the same delicate rose patterns carved into the silver, the same small chain, the same way it caught the light. Thomas felt his heart begin to race. Margaret had always said the locket was special, passed down through her family. But she had no relatives left. She had been adopted as a small child and never knew her birth family. The waitress, whose name tag read Emma, noticed Thomas staring. She smiled warmly as she approached their table with a fresh pot of tea. "Is everything all right, love?" she asked in a soft voice that reminded Thomas somehow of Margaret's gentle way of speaking. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he set down his cup. He tried to find the right words, but his mouth felt dry. "Your necklace," he finally managed to say. "It's beautiful. May I ask where you got it?" Emma's face softened, and she touched the locket gently with her fingers. "It belonged to my grandmother, Rose," she said with obvious love in her voice. "She gave it to me before she passed last year. She always said it was meant to keep our family together, even when we're apart." The words hit Thomas like a gentle wave washing over him. He felt dizzy and had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. Could this be more than just coincidence? In all his years with Margaret, she had never seen another locket like hers. She had spent her whole life wondering about her past, never knowing if she had family somewhere in the world who might be thinking about her. Lucy looked between her father and Emma with wide, curious eyes. She could tell something important was happening, even if she didn't understand what it was. "My mama had a necklace just like that," she said in her small, clear voice. "But she's in heaven now." Emma's expression grew even more tender. "I'm so sorry to hear that, sweetheart," she said, kneeling down to Lucy's level. Your mama must have been very special to have such a beautiful necklace." Thomas felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. Margaret had always believed that family was about more than just blood. It was about the people who loved you and cared for you. She had made him and Lucy into a family with her love, and now she was gone. But looking at this stranger wearing Margaret's locket, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a tiny spark of hope that maybe Margaret's story wasn't over. Maybe there were still pieces of her life waiting to be discovered. Maybe this meeting in a small cafe was exactly what they needed to begin healing their broken hearts. Thomas found himself returning to the cafe the next morning, Lucy in tow. He had barely slept the night before, his mind spinning with thoughts about the locket and what it might mean. Lucy had asked him dozens of questions during their drive back to the hotel, and he had tried his best to explain that sometimes the world works in mysterious ways. Emma greeted them like old friends, her smile brightening the small dining room as soon as she saw them walk through the door. "Well, look who's back," she said cheerfully, wiping her hands on her apron. "I was hoping I might see you two again today." The morning rush had not yet begun. So the cafe was quiet except for the soft sound of coffee brewing and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Thomas felt nervous, like a schoolboy about to ask an important question. Lucy slipped into the same booth they had sat in yesterday, already reaching for her coloring book. "I couldn't stop thinking about your locket," Thomas said carefully, his voice slightly shaky. He had practiced these words in the mirror at the hotel, but now they felt clumsy in his mouth. "My wife, she had one exactly like it. She passed away 6 months ago." Emma's expression grew tender, and she set down the coffee pot she had been holding. Her eyes filled with sympathy as she looked at Thomas. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said softly. "That must be so difficult for you and your daughter." "What was her name?" Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion, even after all these months. It was still hard to talk about Margaret in the past tense. "Margaret," he said quietly. "Margaret and—" Emma gasped, her hand flying to her throat where the silver locket rested. Her face went pale, and she had to steady herself against the nearest table. That was my grandmother's daughter's name," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Rose always talked about her little Margaret, and she was adopted during the war, and Rose spent her whole life trying to find her." Thomas felt the world shift round him. Like everything had suddenly tilted sideways. His heart began to pound, so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Margaret was adopted," he said slowly, hardly believing the words coming out of his mouth. "She never knew her birth mother's name. She only knew she was born during the war." Emma's hands were shaking now, and tears began to well up in her eyes, without saying a word. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. The edges were yellowed with age, and it had been handled so many times that it felt soft like fabric. "Rose kept this her whole life," Emma said, her voice breaking. She said it was the only picture she had of her daughter. She would look at it every day and wonder what had become of her little girl. Thomas stared at the photograph with wide eyes. It showed a 5-year-old girl with curly hair and a bright smile, wearing a simple dress and holding a small doll. But it was the eyes that made his breath catch. They were exactly the same as Margaret's eyes, warm and kind and full of life. It was the same photo he had found among Margaret's few childhood belongings, carefully tucked away in a small box. With her other treasures, "She's family," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Your family." Lucy had been listening to the conversation with growing excitement. She was too young to understand all the details, but she could tell that something wonderful was happening. She looked between the adults with bright eyes, trying to piece together what it all meant. "Does this mean we're not alone anymore, Papa?" she asked in her small, clear voice. Thomas felt tears running down his own cheeks now. For 6 months, he had felt like he and Lucy were floating alone in the world, cut off from everything that had made them feel safe and loved. Margaret had been their anchor, their connection to happiness and warmth. Without her, they had felt lost. But now, looking at Emma's tear-streaked face and the photograph in his hands, Thomas felt something he had not experienced since Margaret's death. It was like a warm light was slowly spreading through his chest, melting away some of the cold sadness that had lived there for so long. Thomas pulled both Emma and Lucy close, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Emma smelled like coffee and cinnamon, and her hair was soft against his cheek. Lucy giggled as she found herself sandwiched between two crying adults. But she seemed to understand that these were happy tears. "No, sweetheart," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're not alone. We're not alone anymore." Round them, the cafe continued its quiet morning routine. But for these 3 people, the world had changed forever. They stood there holding each other, connected by love that had traveled across decades and distance to bring them together. Margaret's locket had finally led them home. Emma asked for time off work to join Thomas and Lucy on their journey to Margaret's hometown. Her manager at the cafe had been understanding when she explained the situation, telling her that some things in life were more important than serving coffee and eggs. Emma packed a small bag with her few belongings and climbed into Thomas's car, feeling nervous but excited about what they might discover together. They were carrying Margaret's ashes in a beautiful wooden box that Thomas kept carefully on the seat beside him. He had been planning this trip for weeks, hoping to find peace in the place where Margaret's story began. Now, with Emma joining them, the journey felt different, less like an ending and more like a beginning. As they drove through the countryside, the landscape rolled by like a patchwork quilt of green fields and small farms. Lucy sat in the back seat, drawing pictures of the cows and horses they passed, while Emma shared stories her grandmother Rose had told her during the long evenings of her childhood. She used to say that somewhere out there, her daughter was living a beautiful life. Emma said, her voice soft with memory. Rose would sit by the window every evening after supper, looking out at the road as if she expected Margaret to walk up the path at any moment. She prayed for her every single day, asking God to keep her safe and happy. Thomas felt his throat tighten as he listened. Margaret always felt like something was missing, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She used to stand by the window in our kitchen and wonder if anyone out there was thinking about her. She would get this faraway look in her eyes, like she was searching for something she couldn't name." Emma wiped tears from her eyes. They were thinking about each other all those years, weren't they? Rose and Margaret, both standing at their windows, both wondering about the other. The drive took them through several small towns, each one looking much like the last, with their main streets lined with old shops and houses with front porches. Lucy pointed out everything that caught her attention: a red barn, a field full of sunflowers, a dog running alongside a fence. Her chatter helped fill the moments when the adults became too emotional to speak. They arrived at Rose's small cottage just as the sun was beginning to set. The house was painted white with blue shutters, and roses grew wild in the front garden. Emma had inherited the house when Rose passed away, but she had been too sad to spend much time there now. Walking up the familiar path with Thomas and Lucy, she felt ready to face the memories inside. The cottage was exactly as Rose had left it. The furniture was old but well cared for, and photographs covered every surface. Emma led them down a narrow hallway to a room at the back of the house. When she opened the door, Thomas gasped. The room was filled with children's clothes, toys, and books that Rose had bought over the years, hoping her daughter would someday come home. There were dresses in every size from toddler to teenager, carefully hung in the closet. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dolls and stuffed animals, board games and picture books. In the corner sat a small rocking horse with a red ribbon tied round its neck. She never gave up hope, Emma said softly, running her fingers over the rocking horse's wooden mane, even when everyone told her to move on. Even when people said she was foolish for keeping this room, she kept believing that Margaret would come back to her. Lucy wandered round the room with wide eyes, touching everything gently as if it might break. She had never seen so many toys in one place. But somehow she understood that they were special. They had been bought with love, and hope by a grandmother she would never meet. On the dresser sat a small music box made of polished wood. Lucy lifted the lid carefully, and it began to play a familiar melody, the same lullaby Margaret used to hum when she thought no one was listening. The tune was soft and sweet, filling the room with gentle music that seemed to make everything glow with warmth. That was Rose's favorite song, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. She used to sing it every night before bed, hoping Margaret could somehow hear it wherever she was. She believed that music could travel across any distance, that love could reach through time and space. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest as he listened to the melody. It was as if Margaret was there in the room with them, surrounded by all the love she had never known existed. For months, he had carried nothing but pain and sadness. But now he felt something different, a deep, peaceful warmth that seemed to wrap round his heart. For the first time since Margaret's death, Thomas felt peace instead of pain. He realized that Margaret had not died unloved and forgotten. She had been cherished every day of her life by a mother who never stopped believing they would find each other again. The music box continued to play its gentle song. Thomas knew that somehow, in some way, Margaret could hear it at last. At the small cemetery where Rose was buried, the three of them stood together under the old oak tree whose branches spread wide like protective arms. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, creating patches of golden light that danced across the weathered headstones. Thomas carried Margaret's ashes in the wooden box, holding it close to his chest like a precious treasure. Emma held a bouquet of pink roses, Rose's favorite flowers, that she had picked from the garden at the cottage that morning. The cemetery was peaceful and quiet, with only the sound of birds singing in the trees and the gentle rustle of leaves. In the breeze, other graves dotted the hillside, each one marking a life that had been lived and loved. Thomas felt a strange comfort in this place, as if all the people resting here were part of one big family. Rose's headstone was simple but beautiful, made of grey stone with her name and dates carved in elegant letters. Below that were the words, "Beloved mother and grandmother." She never stopped believing Emma had chosen those words herself, knowing they captured the essence of who Rose had been. "I wish they could have met," Emma said, her voice breaking as she knelt to place the roses on Rose's grave. Rose died just 2 weeks after Margaret. It's almost like she knew somehow. The doctor said her heart just stopped beating one night while she was sleeping. She looked so peaceful, like she was finally at rest. Thomas knelt down beside Emma and carefully placed Margaret's ashes next to Rose's grave. The wooden box felt warm in his hands, and he imagined he could feel Margaret's presence there with them. "Maybe they're together now," he said gently, his voice full of hope. "Maybe they've finally found each other after all these years of searching." Lucy stood quietly behind them, her small hand resting on Emma's shoulder. She was too young to fully understand death, but she could feel the love and sadness that surrounded this place. She had brought a small drawing she had made of a house with a big garden, and she placed it carefully next to the flowers. Emma pulled out a small wooden box from her bag, her hands shaking slightly. "I found these in Rose's bedroom after she passed," she said, lifting the lid to reveal neat stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon. She wrote to Margaret every year on her birthday, even though she didn't know where to send them. She kept them all, hoping that someday she would be able to give them to her daughter. Inside the box were dozens of letters, each one addressed in Rose's careful handwriting to "My dearest Margaret," and the envelopes were yellowed with age, and some had been opened and refolded many times, as if Rose had read and reread her own words, imagining Margaret's reaction to them. Thomas opened one letter with trembling hands, his eyes glowing with tears as he began to read aloud. The paper was thin and delicate, and Rose's handwriting was beautiful and precise. "My darling daughter," he read, his voice barely above a whisper, "I hope you're happy wherever you are. I hope you know that not a day goes by that I don't think of you. I hope you found a family who loves you as much as I do. Happy birthday, my sweet girl. Love always, Mama." The words seemed to hang in the air on them, filled with all the love and longing that Rose had carried in her heart for so many years. Thomas could picture her sitting at her kitchen table, writing these letters by lamplight, pouring her heart onto paper because she had no other way to reach her daughter. Lucy wrapped her small arms round Thomas's waist, looking up at him with her bright, understanding eyes. "She wasn't forgotten, was she, Papa?" she asked in her clear, innocent voice. "Mana wasn't forgotten at all." "No, sweetheart," Thomas whispered, pulling Lucy close and stroking her hair. "She was loved her whole life, even when she didn't know it. She was thought about and prayed for and missed every single day." Emma wiped tears from her cheeks and reached into her bag again, pulling out small packages of flower seeds. "I thought we could plant a garden here," she said. "Something beautiful that will grow and bloom every year, so they'll never be forgotten." Together, they cleared a small patch of earth beside the graves. Thomas dug small holes with his hands, while Emma and Lucy carefully placed the seeds in the ground. They planted roses for Rose, daisies for Margaret, and sunflowers for Hope. They worked with their hands in the rich, dark earth. Thomas felt the heaviness in his chest begin to lift. The physical work of planting felt healing somehow, like they were creating something new and beautiful from their sadness. Lucy giggled as she got dirt under her fingernails. Emma smiled as she showed her how to cover the seeds gently with soil. They watered the newly planted garden with an old watering can Emma had brought from the cottage, and then stood back to admire their work. The garden was small but perfect, a symbol of love that would continue to grow and flourish long after they had gone home. Thomas felt Margaret's presence there with them, and he knew that she would have loved this place and this moment of connection with the family she had never known. 1 year later, Emma had moved to the small town where Thomas and Lucy lived. She had found a job at the local bakery, and the owner had been delighted to learn that she knew how to make the special bread that Rose had been famous for in her own town. Emma rented a small apartment just 2 streets away from Thomas and Lucy's house, close enough that Lucy could ride her bicycle there after school. The silver locket now hung round Lucy's neck, continuing its journey through generations of women who carried love in their hearts. Thomas had given it to her on her 8th birthday, explaining that it was meant to connect their family across time and distance. Lucy wore it every day, touching it gently whenever she missed her mama or felt scared about something. Every afternoon, after school, Lucy would run to Emma's apartment, where the smell of fresh bread always filled the air. Emma had taught her to bake Rose's special bread recipe, the same one that Rose had made for Emma when she was a little girl. They would stand together in the small kitchen, Lucy on her little stool so she could reach the counter, mixing flour and yeast and water with their hands. Rose always said that bread was like love. Emma would tell Lucy as they kneaded the dough together. It needs time and patience and gentle care to grow into something beautiful. Lucy would giggle and make silly faces with the flour on her nose, but she listened carefully to every story Emma shared about their family's history that Margaret never knew. Every Sunday, they visited the community garden they had planted in Margaret's memory. What had started as a small patch of flowers beside Rose's grave had grown into something much bigger. The town had given them permission to create a memorial garden in the park, where vegetables grew alongside flowers, feeding both body and soul. Lucy had her own small section where she grew cherry tomatoes and marigolds. She would water them carefully with her tiny watering can, talking to the plants as if they could hear her. "Tell me about great-grandmother Rose again." She would ask Emma as they worked together in the soil, and Emma would share another story about the woman who never stopped believing in love's power to reunite families. Thomas found himself smiling more often now. The house that had felt empty and cold for so many months was filled with Emma's laughter and the smell of fresh bread that she brought over every evening. She would join them for dinner, and afterward they would sit in the living room while Lucy played on the floor and Emma told stories about Rose's life. He realized that Margaret's greatest gift wasn't just the love she had given him, but the family she had unknowingly led him to find. Without Margaret's locket, without her adoption story, without the mysterious connection that had brought them all together, he and Lucy would still be alone in their grief instead. They had found Emma, and through her, they had found a whole history of love that stretched back through generations. Emma had brought photo albums from Rose's house, filled with pictures of relatives that Margaret had never known existed. There were aunts and uncles and cousins, all with the same gentle eyes that Lucy had inherited. Emma would point to each face and tell Lucy their names and stories, creating a family tree that had been broken but was now growing strong again. On what would have been Margaret's birthday, they gathered in the garden to release white balloons into the sky. It had become their tradition, a way to honor Margaret's memory and send their love up to heaven where she could receive it. Lucy held the locket close to her heart and whispered, "Thank you, Mama, for bringing us together." Thomas watched the balloons disappear into the clouds, their white shapes growing smaller and smaller until they were just tiny dots against the blue sky. He felt Margaret's presence like a warm embrace, surrounding him with the same love that had carried him through their marriage and now through this new chapter of their lives. He understood now that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, creating new connections and healing old wounds. Margaret's love had led them to Emma, and Emma's love had brought Rose's memory back to life. Lucy's love had helped them all heal from their sadness and find joy again in simple things like baking bread and planting flowers. The garden round them was bursting with life. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, sunflowers turned their faces toward the sun, and roses climbed up a wooden trellis that Thomas had built with his own hands. Families from the neighborhood came to visit the garden, bringing their children to play and picking vegetables to take home for dinner. Emma took his hand, and Lucy took hers, and together they walked home as the sun began to set behind the trees. They were no longer three separate people touched by loss, but a family united by love that had waited patiently across time to bring them together. Their footsteps made soft sounds on the gravel path, and Lucy skipped between them, humming the same lullaby that Rose had sung so many years ago at home. They would have dinner together, and Lucy would show them her drawings from school. Emma would help her with her homework while Thomas washed the dishes. And later they would all sit together on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one in the darkening sky.